The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be part of this debate, and I'd like to start simply by saying that, from my perspective, the question really is whether or not Canada's involvement in the way proposed by the government, in the terms proposed by the government, is necessary. And if it's not absolutely necessary from a Canadian point of view, is it wise? And that includes the broader question of, can we contribute in other ways that are at some level smarter or more effective than what's being proposed by the government? That's the overall framework I'd like us to think about. I'd also like to start with a premise. The premise is that we're all on the same page about the nature of ISIS, the barbaric nature of ISIS. And I think it's really important to remind everybody here that there's a consensus in society, not just amongst Canadians, it's not just the coalition that sees this. Importantly, it's also Muslim and Muslim communities in this country. And I think it's important that we all hear the Canadian Council of Imams, August 22nd, in a statement saying the following, and I'd like to have this as a starting point for the consensus that we all know there is a problem. Quote, the Canadian Council of Imams totally reiterates its past declarations condemning violent extremism. With respect to ISIS, we declare the following. ISIS has manifested some of the worst and barbaric human behavior. They claim to establish a so-called Islamic caliphate, but their abomination does exactly the opposite of what Islam calls upon believers to do, namely establish peace and justice and safeguard human rights. We categorically condemn the actions of this group and its monstrous crimes against humanity absolutely and without equivocation. Since their advent, ISIS mercenaries have caused nothing but destruction and corruption and have violated core Islamic teachings and principles such as the sanctity of life and the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. We call upon all Canadian Muslims to denounce this deliberate perversion of the Muslim faith and to dissociate themselves totally from such a despicable ideology and dangerous people who intentionally use the name of Islam in their ongoing campaign of distortion and destruction. Canadian Muslim communities wholeheartedly understand and believe that it is a religious and a civic duty to promote and support peaceful coexistence and multiculturalism and to condemn bigotry, hate, and discrimination against any group, here and everywhere. That is essential to being both Muslim and a Canadian. End of quotation, Mr. Speaker. So I think this starting point reminds us that we can all share this point of view, this horrible, almost primordial reaction to the horrific nature of ISIS. It doesn't tell us whether or not a particular course of action makes sense, and it doesn't tell us whether or not behind a proposed course of action there's actually a workable strategy. I think the question of strategy, Mr. Speaker, is really important because we know that at some levels, not entirely, what's going on now in northern Iraq, also with ISIS in Syria, but especially in Iraq, is part of the blowback effect from the invasion in 2003 in Iraq. It's not a new conflict in that sense. It's but the next phase of something that was started in 2003. And it's the combined effect of the incredibly wrong-minded, and in fact, John Dower, probably the leading scholar in the world of what I would call defeat studies, how one moves from conflict to peaceful reconstruction of a country. He talks about the strategic imbecility of what went on in 2003. How the Americans went in with eyes wide shut, had no plan whatsoever, despite all kinds of planning that was available, it was all ignored. And out of that emerged chaos, and out of that emerged an invigorated al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually metastasized into a bunch of groups, including the current group. And as such, we have to ask, what good will it do for Westerners, especially led by the U.S., to get involved again in the same way, especially when there is no sign whatsoever of any overarching understanding of the complexity of the situation on the ground and what kind of planning would actually end up solving the problems there in the medium or the long term. I also think it's important that we really realize that airstrikes have a particular cachet and a particular downside. However much they're part of warfare, I'm not naive about that. In the age that we live in, we've come to understand how civilian casualties are part and parcel of airstrikes as a method of war. Even more so when we know that the fighters that are being struck embed themselves close or within civilian populations. And this is in the context of us joining up with the Americans when they've just announced that the previous tightened rules on striking targets in the so-called war against terror has now been broadened again from a near certainty that civilians won't be harmed to the general laws of humanitarian law, the general laws of war, which frankly leave a lot of scope. And this is at a time when commentators like Alan Dershowitz are actually calling on Obama to say the way in which Israel went about attacks in Gaza should become the norm for understanding how difficult it is to enforce a near certainty principle. He's actually said Obama finally realizes how difficult it is. So whether one thinks that Israel in Gaza was engaging lawfully or not lawfully, the reality is that civilians get in the way. Now, why am I emphasizing that? I'm emphasizing that, Mr. Speaker, because of the reaction. The question is, what good is going to come from very, very cynically manipulated facts and images coming out of ISIS and partners about the killing of civilians on the ground? It's already begun. As a colleague in Toronto-Danforth has written to me, quote, ISIS is not sitting out in the desert with the target painted around them. They're embedded in towns and cities, in buildings full of civilians. The possibility of massive civilian casualties perpetrated by the good guys is unjustifiable and fuels, this is the point, further anger and an increased sense of the West versus Islam. I was also written to by another member of my constituency who says, quote, I am an Iraqi-born Canadian. My family left Iraq at the beginning of the Saddam era. I'm extremely alarmed and saddened by what is happening in Iraq. However, I don't think Canada should play a role in combat intervention. The Americans and the British put Iraq in an environment that nurtured such extremist groups. I would like to see Canada play a role, but in more humanitarian and diplomatic ways. She goes on to say, I would urge Canada in finding ways to stop countries from financially supporting ISIL. And I'll get to that because I think if we focus on the reality, it's not just the Americans that opened up the current situation. Frankly, it's Saudi Arabia as well. The birthplace and the continuing nurturing source for Wahhabism of a particularly virulent kind that easily metastasizes into exactly the kinds of groups that we see is fueled by financing and a government turning its eyes and intelligence agencies turning its eyes on the millions and millions of dollars and the support coming out of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has 1,000 combat aircraft, Mr. Speaker. What if we were to say, you know, airstrikes, if they must be part of saving immediate lives, why should they be part Western airplanes? Saudi Arabia has 1,000 combat aircraft. Saudi Arabia is the heart of Sunni Islam that's causing what's going on in northern Iraq and Syria. Surely a Sunni-on-Sunni dimension to this would be far more beneficial than a West versus a fictionalized version of Islam in the minds of these monsters. The last thing I'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, is this is not the only crisis in the world. Canada has only so many resources and so much money. We know that massive help is needed in West Africa with respect to Ebola. Even the Americans are sending troops there because of that realization. We know that we should be involved, at least from the NDP perspective, we should be involved in peacekeeping and, frankly, state rebuilding, if it ever existed, in the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic, exactly. Especially given our experience in Africa, our French language capacities, Not everyone needs to pile on to the same crisis. We have about 60 partners, is it, in this crisis? What can Canada do where capacity is desperately needed in other parts of the world? That would be a question I would ask, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.